Those of you who were not here last week, the introductory sheet that you have is the same as the introduction in the booklet. But since I didn't know that I'd have the booklets back from the printer in time, I went ahead and run these off. And so we're working a little bit from this sheet, but basically you have that material twice in your hands. Those who were here last week know that we emphasize that in understanding the will of God, there's been a great deal of confusion, and we'll be talking more about that confusion a little later today, Lord willing. But you really get a grasp of the will of God in a three-dimensional pattern that we introduced last week. There's God's ideal will. It's always good, and we will be seeing that both in passages and illustrations and things. Then there's His allowed will. And it's important to keep that in mind because of what springs out of His allowing us to do our own thinking and choices. And then the sobering part, maybe the most sobering part, is the third section, the ultimate will of God. And in paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, those three wills are mentioned along with a number of passages. Last Wednesday, we primarily spent our time in regard to God's ideal will, noting that it is centered generally in regard to the covenants that He has made with men down through the ages. We generally think of an old and a new covenant, but if you look carefully in the old covenant, you will find 2 or 3 times that they renewed that covenant, or God enlarged on that covenant. And we're not going to deal with that paragraph then, His ideal will, unless it be by just chance mentioning it. I want us to come now more to God's allowed will and then look at God's ultimate will. And this isn't something that's difficult to any one of you because of your biblical background, but in case you were studying with someone else and you needed to emphasize this particular point, and before we're finished, I think today you'll see it's important that we recognize the allowed will that God has given. We're going to look at 1 or 2 of those passages, and then you can look at all of them on your own and pick up this idea of His allowed will. That's in really the 3rd paragraph, and I want us to look for a moment or two in Joshua, the 24th chapter. We'll look in verse 15 and then probably look at verses 22 through 25, as it is, I guess, one of the most oft-quoted passages that would emphasize human choice. It's very evident from what Joshua stated beginning in verse 15 that people have a choice in this matter and dealing with God, not just with each other, but with God. Notice Joshua 24:15, if you have your Bible open there now. Joshua said, "And if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord," then here's our key word, "choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served," and he mentions back in other territory over the river and so forth. And then down at the end of that verse he says, "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The involvements in serving the Lord shows up more when you drop down to verse 22 and observe the statement. You might look at that now. Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen for yourselves to serve the Lord or your God." They made a choice, but they had a choice. That's the point we're making. And then he added, "Now therefore, put away the foreign gods which are in your midst." And then he goes on and describes that they must then determine that they will obey the Lord. So they're entering into a covenant arrangement with God, but they had the choice. And that choice involved putting away the other gods and other factors. He adds, the people said to Joshua then, "We will serve the Lord our God, and we will obey His voice." A choice and a decision, but also entwined with it is a commitment. And that's where really the will of God then comes in, because we can choose not to do it, we can choose to do it. And I say that's nothing new, but I'm just mentioning these passages in the event you were emphasizing to people that they certainly have a choice, and that's recognized both by we ourselves, and God recognizes that. Part of God's will, then, is His allowed will. Another passage or two we want to look in that regard. Turn to Proverbs, the 1st chapter. I'd like for us to check something there. It's just sobering because it identifies how God feels when we don't obey His voice, if we made a choice to obey His voice. That's beginning in Proverbs 1, verse 22. Solomon wrote, "How long, O naive ones, will you love simplicity? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you." And then he adds in verse 24 that they didn't respond very well to his words. Verse 24 of Proverbs 1. "Because I called you and you refused. I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. And you neglected all my counsel. I will even, and did not want my reproof." And then he added this on the basis, if you check there are 4 ways in which God pleaded with them to do His will. He called, no man regarded. He stretched out His hand, they didn't pay attention. And I think we all have lived on the earth long enough to know somebody somewhere that's had about that type of response to God. They haven't answered God's call or listened to it, not paid attention. God then said, "I will even laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm, and your calamity comes on like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me. They made a choice. But God said, I'll not answer. So here is some of the nature of God that's leading toward His ultimate will. He's going to prevail. But there's that human response, and you could look at any of the other passages there. I'm going to take just a little bit longer to go into some of the expressions in seeking to understand God's will. This sounds pretty harsh on God's part, doesn't it? Think of 1 John 4:8, God is love. And does this sound like a love statement to you? I'm looking in verse 26. I will even laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind. God will mock, He'll laugh at your calamity. And that might cause you, if you were just casually reading, why did God say that when God is always good? Well, we'll be studying throughout these 13 weeks that there are very times when God goes so far. Now, that's getting down into the next stage, God's ultimate will. But lest we think God is unfair, and I don't think anyone present here would think that, but I want you to see what really He said back in verses 22 and 24. Because we can read by words and not quite grasp what all they entail, but God knows what His will is and what words mean. And He may see things a little differently then than how we would see it, because we're measuring it with our insight as to those terms. Now I'm looking especially in verse 22. How long, O naive ones, will you love simplicity? Notice the word love and simplicity. We're going to look at simplicity in just a moment. And then, and scoffers delight themselves. That's a certain brand and type of people. And fools hate knowledge. Those are pretty strong terms in regard to people's, the reaction of people. And I think we'll see that better when we look at these terms. The Hebrew word for simple or simplicity is pethi, P-E-T-H-I. And notice what that word means. And in a moment, we're going to broaden out these definitions into circumstances that are going on, some of them right now. And we may appreciate a little bit more why God gets upset when He sees His creatures down here acting like they are. But first of all, simplicity. You love simplicity. What does the word really mean? Now, we would each have our own idea, see if it fits this Hebrew term. It's described as folly and a silly person. I don't know if you like foolish and silly people or not. You might get a little upset if you see what we're about to get in these definitions. Notice this, one easily persuaded and enticed. That kind of person. Easily persuaded and enticed. And then it relates also to many that are unskillful. Now, one person may not fit all of that, but that's the basic background meaning to the word simplicity or simple people. And I believe that's a little deeper than most of us tie in with just, he's a simple person. We might say that and think highly of the individual in some respects. But I doubt that we would go along with this type people that are easily persuaded and enticed, unskillful, and silly. That can hurt if it comes right into your dwelling or your association. People you'd just rather be away from. And you may think of some like that. Come to the scoffers. The Hebrew term is lutz, L-U-T-S, lutz. And it means to speak barbarously, deride, to mock anyone. And again, that's a little deeper than we might think of as scoffers, though close to what we might consider. And then the word fools is also in that verse. And the Hebrew term is Keesee, K-E-S-I-L. Some of you have heard me mention that one before because it's especially in Ecclesiastes where Solomon talks about fools. And I mentioned that I am bothered a little bit by that because it sounds so much like Keesee. Keesee, K-E-S-I-L, and it means someone self-confident, cocky, arrogant, hates knowledge, does not delight in understanding. They just seem to want to go counter to others and are producers of conflicts. Now, I'm going to take those three terms and put them into just practical living. The ones that are simple, easily persuaded, that's the type of individual that will take just about anything. Now, I'm going to mention some things, and I don't think I'll be getting on anyone's toes here, but you will know people that were the type that take anything, smoke, drink, drugs, often looking for an easy way out. Do we know anyone? Oh, yes, we do. Members of the church, and certainly out in the world. Our nation is burdened by this type personality, that they don't make good choices since they have this allowed will of God. And so they'll take anything and maybe follow anyone. And then the scoffers. Those were the ones that we noted that are acting barbarously, mocking, deriding people. They take the wrong thing. And there would be those involved in demonstrations, violence, destructive things. Do we have anything going on in our country now where people are being violent and demonstrating? And often destructive. Now there's your scoffer. Now they down in their thinking made a choice that what they're doing is justified. But I hope that we will recognize that God might measure it some other way. And then the fools, the self-confident. If you haven't picked up these words, one group will take anything, some take the wrong thing and demonstrate and demand, and this last one is they'll take nothing. Here are your people that are stubborn, dictators, they come out of this. They want to rule, not be ruled. And the stubborn, domineering, demanding, self-confident. Do you remember Jesus, and he was quoting from Isaiah who had said it earlier, having ears they hear not, eyes they see not. There are your fools who, even if truth comes their way, won't listen. Now, these are the ones, remember, that deal with this response on God's part then in Proverbs 1, that when they respond and their calamity comes, I'll laugh at it. They should have known better. They made the wrong choices. They had allowance, but they made the wrong choices. Well, I don't want to take too much time of that, but you can pick up these. I might look at one other in the New Testament. I think we have listed there Hebrews 11, 24 and 25. Now this is putting it on the positive standpoint in regard to human allowance and human choices. When you have Pharaoh being raised in Egypt, and Moses was brought into the picture, and Hebrews 11, 14 and 15 gives us a little bit of an insight as to, well, I said 14, 15, it's 24 and 25. 24 and 25. Moses made a choice. He had an allowance, but look what he chose. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Think how many people in Egypt would have been happy to be in that location. Pharaoh's daughter. After all, Pharaoh, at that time, when Egypt was the strongest nation probably on the earth, and he was the emperor or the head of that, and you can be sure that the grandson would be a pampered and a well cared for young man. Well, that's how Moses grew up. And it says he refused that, made a choice. Choosing rather to suffer, look at this next part, ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Do you see a different type choice here now? From one who could have had about anything and who was well educated by the Egyptians, no doubt about it. Moses was a fantastic leader. He didn't realize it as much as God did until he was 80 years old. But you know the life of the man and the impact he had on Israel and other nations. And it came through a choice. And this time a positive choice. In the outline material that I've done on Hebrews, on this passage, I've just jotted down about our own day now. We have choices. And I just made a chart in the outline material. I didn't bring that with me or hand it out to you, but I'll quickly just survey it to show the beauty of what really Moses did and the type choices you and I need to make. And I just put instead of, and then I put one column in one category of thinking, and then another column. And here are the two columns. Instead of pleasure, have patience or steadfastness instead of pleasure. Some of these words are very closely related. Instead of lust, have love. Instead of thrills, people like thrills. Take the truth. Instead of promiscuity, work for purity. Instead of seductive sex, maintain self-control. Choices. Instead of comfort, choose Christ. Now, I'm not saying that if you choose Christ that you'd never have comfort. Oh no, in some ways, we have a peace that what? Passes understanding, Philippians 4, about verse 7. But there are a lot of people who want comfort, and they don't want to go through anything that's very heavy. Living in some parts of the world not as easy as it is here, and we don't want to go to those parts of the world. I'm not saying, I'm using we in the generalized sense. It's real easy to make a choice for the comforts rather than what Christ may leave. In 1 Peter 2:21, we're to follow in his footsteps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. When he was reviled, revile not again. When he suffered, threaten not. Fabulous standard he set. But it's a challenge to be like him. And then, instead of self-satisfaction, choose the Spirit and what he would desire. These are choices, and people are making them. And thus, need to keep that in mind, because down the road a little ways, that's going to be important in our understanding the will of God in some areas. But it springs from the fact that a part of his will is his allowed will. We'll look at Matthew 5:45, where Jesus said that he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends his rain on the just and the unjust. God's allowed will allows people to be unjust, allows people to be evil. But now let's go to this next one, because it is, as I said, probably the most sobering of the three. One is just beautiful and good and could help us be good. But the other part we definitely need to recognize, or we may not properly respond to his ideal will. And what's that? His ultimate will. Sooner or later, it won't be what we desire, but what he dictates. God's ultimate will. That's that third paragraph, and you'll see a whole string of passages that we've listed there. I'm going to look at 2 or 3 of those just briefly. Look in Deuteronomy, the 11th chapter. We'll look in verses, 1 through 4 kind of gives the introduction to the chapter. And we might touch on 1 or 2 of those, but then we'll get down to verses 11 through 15, where God gives some more information about a will that he made back then. Not saying this is the ultimate will, but it does indicate God has responsibility he's given to people all along the way. Never has left, as we'll see in another passage later on, never has left himself without witness. He's made his will known. And thus Deuteronomy 11, what does it say? You shall therefore love the Lord your God and always keep his charge, his statutes, his testimonies, and his commandments. If we were doing a study of Deuteronomy, we won't get definitions as to what the statutes and ordinances and commandments are. They overlap some with one another, but there's some distinction between maybe a statute. I'll just mention, for example, the statutes, especially what the Levitical priests and all would have done in their priestly function, statutes. Whereas thou shalt not kill in the 10 Commandments is a commandment, obviously. And I don't need to go into that. That's another study in regard. But it does say that we need to love the Lord our God and always keep his charge. Drop on down now to verse 11, and we'll pick up just a verse or 2 for you to see what I'm talking about. And I'm trying to move on through this, and you can read these passages more in detail on your own. Deuteronomy 11, starting in verse 11. But the land which you are about to cross to possess, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from, and it goes on to describe how heaven supplies. What we're dealing with here is God is ensuring them that, like it's stated in a number of places, that's a land of milk and honey. Some of you have heard me mention when I was in Jerusalem, I went into a supermarket while there, and it shocked me. Two ways. One way was what all I saw that they had there. And Crest couldn't do much better, or whoever else, Winco, or wherever you go. It was a fabulous, huge display of excellent food, and most of it was raised in that country. Best ketchup I've ever eaten we had in Nigeria, but I found out it's made in Jerusalem. And so when God said this land was good, it really was. And thus here is a parallel with his ideal will. In fact, it's a part of it, of the good things that he gives. And it continues to go on and describe in the following verses. I'm in verse 14 now, I will give the rain for your land in its season, the early and the late rain. And you can just read any of those verses. I will give grass in your fields for your cattle, and you shall eat and be satisfied. This whole context is a place where it'd be fairly easy to be satisfied of God's blessings. Now there's Deuteronomy 11, and there are the blessings. Of course, you know there's also the other side. Look in Deuteronomy 27. We'll just look at a verse or two there. And you, as I say, can read these more in detail later. I'm just letting you see the context as it relates to God's will. And he promises that's his responsibility to really take care of his people. And he promises to do it so very, very well. In Deuteronomy 27, you might look in verse 11. Moses also charged the people on that day, saying, when you come to the Jordan, and then he begins a description of, in verse 13, Mount Ebal, and then later he'll talk about Mount Gerizim, or I think Marty pronounced it Gerizim. I was able to stand at that spot, generally, and to this day, this is centuries after this was written, and it just stunned me, because where I was standing, I could look one way toward Mount Ebal, and I'll tell you, a ground squirrel wouldn't even want to try to live there. It's just barren, hardly anything. And you look the other way, and it's great big plush evergreen trees. That's Mount Gerizim, or Gerizim. And to this day, they could stand at that spot and read this passage, and God, of course, pronounced curses through varied ones. If you look at the context, the tribes there are listed, have these particular ones read the curses. And then he had other parts of the 12 tribes read the blessings and prosperity. And they did that when they came into the country. And it is mentioned now just to indicate God said If you obey me, all these blessings will follow. If you do not obey me, these curses will follow. So he started back in the days from the very beginning to emphasize that he would make people give an account, his ultimate will. It's going to be done. And we could read on down through verse 26. In fact, in the outline, I've got a section there, if you will note, in Deuteronomy that relates to chapter 27, 1 through 18, 13. That's all of one chapter, and into the next chapter that's just giving blessings and cursings. And if you haven't read that, it's sobering to see the curses that God would pronounce upon them. And yet, look at the other side. He at the same time offered tremendous blessings. You might think today in regard to Judgment Day and then what follows. Think of heaven. Blessings beyond what we can visualize. But we know enough to know it will be a fabulous place in which to dwell. And you look the other side, what? Hell. And it also is the most sobering trials. There's God's ultimate will. I have there in the outline a statement that has a footnote to it. I picked this up from Denny Petrillo in his commentary on Ezekiel. But turn over to Ezekiel, and just for you to pick up, you'll notice in the footnote, or in the outline I have mentioned from that footnote, that God expressed his judgments in one way just through Ezekiel, and he did it in the book of Ezekiel 63 times. And what I'm going to do is just take a chapter, one chapter, turn over to Ezekiel, the 6th chapter, and we will let you see how often this phrase that we've mentioned is stated. Ezekiel 6 and verse 6. Kelly, you're back there at the back. Why don't you read that verse for us? Ezekiel 6, verse 6. It's not very long.
In all your dwellings the cities will be laid waste, and the high places ruined, so that your altars will be laid waste and ruined. Your idols will be shattered and demolished, your incense altars will be broken down, and your works wiped out.
Then they will know that I am the Lord. Why? By the judgments being pronounced on them. While you're there, Kelly, read verse 7.
The slain will fall among you, and then you will know that I am the Lord.
There it is again. Well, drop on down to verse 10.
They will know that I am the Lord. My threats to bring this catastrophe on them were not.
You see what I'm doing? I'm just letting you see how often he uses that phrase. And of course, it wasn't Ezekiel, it was God stating what he was doing. And in each time, it's pronouncing judgments, circumstances that have come upon the people. And he says, and when that happens to you, then you'll know. Do you remember Proverbs 1 just a few moments ago when God said, I called and no man regarded? I stretched out my hand, no one paid attention, no one stopped. And then he said what? When your calamity comes, I will not listen. Well, this is just repeatedly stated in Ezekiel to emphasize that God does intend for us to give an account. And you have a number of passages there in the outline that deal with that idea. But The fact that it's in Ezekiel 63 times sounds like God was trying to make a point. And they'll know that I'm God. Well, that's what we have then in a passage like Philippians 2, 9 through 11. It mentions because of what Christ did, taking on the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of man, being found in fashion as a man, humbled himself unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore, God highly exalted him and gave unto him the name that is above every name, that every knee should bow, of things in the heavens, things on the earth, things under the earth, apparently the dead referred to, under the earth. But every knee is going to bow, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Ultimate will. It's going to happen. And that's the reason we state that there'll be no atheists in hell. By the time they get there, they'll know there is God, and they will have acknowledged it. Today we can carry out Matthew 10:32. Jesus said, whosoever will confess me before men, him will I confess before the Father who is in heaven. But then he added, whosoever will deny me before men, him will I deny before the Father. And so every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. I imagine each of you did that somewhere. I remember it was outside the church building, dirt floor, and we had an arbor, and I had come forward during the last night of a gospel meeting, and we had wiring strung up on some cedar poles, and we were meeting outside. That is because some people might drive up and listen that wouldn't come inside. Anyway, to get the people to hear the word. But in that gospel meeting, I still remember that I made that confession. Now, that is, of course, not the only time, but that was the time before I was baptized into Christ. And you probably can remember doing that somewhere, sometime. The point is, though, everybody's going to do it. And that's a part of what God has revealed in His will, His ultimate will. The other passage that especially would be meaningful there would be Romans 12, 10 through 12, that we must all give an account unto God. Passages you've probably heard quoted a number of times. And every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. There it is again in Romans 12. And hence that ultimate will. The other passage that's listed there in the outline, Revelation 20:11 through 15, it just pictures the judgment scene, ultimately the great white throne, him who sat thereon and so forth. And it says the books were opened, and another book, which is the book of life. Now, the book of life tells all about Sister Merrill. Did you know she's in the book of life? I hope you are. And there is, in God's laboratory, where Hal has a little booth here to try to put things together and help disseminate things out. Imagine what his recording has been through the centuries. It has a record. But the books were opened. And that's this right here. Really, for you and me, it's right here. The books were opened, Revelation 20. And everyone was judged out of the things that are written in the books. Ultimate will. And that's a part of the nature of God's will, His ideal will, but he lets us make a choice. Choose you this day whom you will serve. And other passages we looked at. I called, no one regarded. Well, we can do that now. We can make that choice. But then ultimately, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Number of passages there that verify the same basic thought. I would like for you to come in the outline now, down to the statement. Which paragraph is it? 1, 2, 3, 4. Fifth paragraph. A focused coverage. Focus means things are seen as they really are, not fuzzy, hazy, foggy. A focused coverage of these three segments of God's will would offer a solution. That's why we're studying it. To multiple problems people have projected over the years as to God's nature, position, and response to people, especially to human suffering, trials, and tragedies. We'll enlarge that more as we go through the weeks, because that's one of the areas that's difficult for some to see. Because of a lack of theological clarity. People read one passage and get one idea and try to summarize it all there, and that's not all of it. Just like here, we have taken some passages and they're curses, but we take other verses and they're blessings. Well, God has so dealt with us in His will. And sometimes people just see one thing and then they run off with a conclusion. Over in the 119th Psalm, really, it says, the sum of thy word is truth. And we need to see it that way, because sometimes you can look at something and see one thing and draw one conclusion, and if you look at the same thing at another time, it will look differently. I mentioned to some of you when I had engineer drawing at Abilene Christian, the final test we had was to draw, engineer drawing, one vise. But we had to do it 5 ways. And if you take one of these just old screw vices and you look at it from on top, it looks quite different than it does when you look at it at the side. But if you really want to get a difference, get down at the end of it, and it sure enough doesn't look the same. God's will has blessings, has curses, and we're going to see redemption in there too somewhere. In regard to when we made wrong choices, did He give up on us? Thank God He didn't. And all of that's a part of His will in the 3 dimensions that we've looked at. Now, come back to this particular verse. So the theological study of God, clarity, isn't there. Plus you have then a good dose of devilish deception from the beginning. Go to Genesis 3, 1 through 5. You're familiar with it, and we can just make reference to it. But Eve, looking at the tree, saw that it was a tree to be desired, to make one wise. And then there was the devilish statement. God knows the day you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you'll be as God. Well, that sounds so good. Sounded so good to her that she ate. And so did Adam. And there have been problems in one way or another ever since. That's what we mean here by devilish deception. That can cause God's will to be frustrating and confusing. There have been repeated surges of humanistic speculations. And I'm taking time on this because we're about to look at a string of terms, and you can read through them right quickly, but you may not realize how far-reaching the scope of them. those speculations have surfaced in multiple forms, and here's what I'm talking about. I then have jotted down philosophic perceptions, human legislation, doctrinal divisions, scientific theories, fleshly follies, erroneous extremism. That's a whole string of words, and I wasn't just trying to be wordy. Did you know there are circumstances that have affected people in every one of those categories? Come back to philosophic perceptions. That factor I mentioned briefly last session that we had. If God is almighty and all-powerful and God is love, then why do people suffer? Why are people going hungry? If God's almighty, couldn't He give them food? And that's been a problem. And some of the philosophers, some like Plato, Socrates, and others, that in many ways did some pretty good thinking, tried to figure out how to balance that. If God is all-powerful and He is love, why are things in the mess they're in? Well, if you just look at it from the standpoint of God's power and God's love, it is frustrating. But that developed the philosophical idea of deism. Ruth just gave me a little point that indicated time's about up. I have about 5 minutes to cover 3 or 4 things. Deism basically has the idea that God does have all power. And since there's so much suffering and God is love, then God must have gone into isolation. Now that's deism. It's a philosophy. And varied ones have followed that philosophy. The next one, human legislation. That is what's been caused by might makes right. Dictators and others have come from that standpoint, and it's humanism gone to the point of control, domination. We've already talked some about that in regard to the self-confident people and all. And then doctrinal divisions. There is the idea of Calvinism just as one of the doctrines. People often say that the basic network of the doctrine of John Calvin was TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, and the T stands for total depravity. Some people forever condemned. Unconditional election. That is, God made the choice, not man. Limited atonement. Only certain ones will be saved and certain ones will be lost. Well, that's right, but he had the wrong background to justify his conclusion on it. Irresistible grace. There's the I. Once saved, always saved. Doctrine. If you're God's powerful, irresistible. And then perseverance of the saints cannot fall from grace. Now all of that's this tulip doctrine of John Calvin. And you know what started all that? He was trying to elevate the supremacy of God until people would submit to God's law, which was a good idea. God is supreme, and we do need to submit. And it was because there had become so much of the Roman Catholic pattern of go through rituals and you're okay. Some have talked about the working your way to heaven and so forth. But the idea of buying indulgences and a number of traditional rules that had gotten into the mix until people were very frustrated and angry, and that's what brought on the Reformation period in history. And it primarily was John Calvin's intent to get back to let God govern. And that was good. But he did it to the point of making everybody under God's control completely, And so a person didn't have anything to do with the salvation. It all came from God. But we do, didn't Peter say in Acts 2, save yourselves from this crooked generation? Acts 2:40. Well, there's that. Well, I may not have time to cover these, but every one of these has a background to them. These things have happened. They're part of history. It's going on. Philosophical perceptions, human legislation, doctrinal division, scientific theories, theory of evolution, Big Bang theory. These things have come on. Why? Well, people can see a heavens and an earth, and they're scientifically discovering more and more. And they don't know how to explain it, so they come up with a theory that it was an evolution. And have we had anything like that in our day? Well, that's just one of the examples of scientific theories. What are they trying to do? Explain God and His will. They have that as a background to it. And then fleshly follies. Acts 17, Paul talked about the Epicureans, and the idea is eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you're going to die. Have a good time. Where'd they get that kind of pattern of living? Well, they more or less moved away from God, and in a humanistic standpoint, why not? They don't have a judgment or an eternity in the thinking. And then the other one, erroneous extremism. Of course, that would be atheism. On the one hand, there is no God. And on the other hand, there are those that are polytheistic, many gods. That's still going on. Why? Because basically there has been a lack of understanding of the will of God. Other things have come in the way. Well, we'll try to finish up the introduction, Lord willing, next Wednesday. And I hope, though, that you see the benefit if we get in focus the ideal will of God and the allowed will of God. We do have a choice, and that's God's goodness. And then we must keep in mind the ultimate will of God. Get all that in focus. The Bible, in many places where it's been difficult, I think, will be easily understood. We'll try to see that through the study to come. Appreciate you being here, and you are dismissed.